Trail of the occult begins in Egypt 5,000 years ago. Just before the rise of Egypt's great pharaohs, hieroglyphics or pictographs were invented. Egyptians used them to document their history and religion, and to practice complex systems of astronomy, astrology, and geometry. They believed their powerful knowledge came from the god Thoth.
Thoth, or Tahuti, was the Egyptian god of magic. And more than just the god of magic, he was the god of writing, of astronomy, of mathematics and science. He invented language, invented writing.
Only priests with special training were allowed access to Thoth's sacred knowledge. Imhotep, builder of the first pyramid, was one of the chosen.
Thoth was considered to be the one who gave us writing and numbers and the arts of self-cultivation through works of consciousness. Some people thought he was a person who was then deified through his accomplishments. Other people feel that this has been a mythical entity from the beginning.
Legends held that a book of magic written by Thoth contained the secrets of the gods.
The Book of Thoth was actually considered to be in the astral plane. Not a physical thing, but something that you had to actually travel in consciousness to arrive at. And so this is probably one of those very old incidences of channeling, where an individual would get into a special state of mind, contact the Thoth energy wherever it was to be found, and then be tutored by this multilingual, multi-code kind of consciousness.
If you were to describe the Book of Thoth, you could also, look at a building like the pyramid or the Sphinx and say that the teachings contained therein are pages within the Book of Thoth. So all measurement, all words, all concepts are part of the Book of Thoth.
But no Book of Thoth has ever been found. The god is said to have buried it beneath the Nile and protected its secrets with a deadly curse. Modern archaeologists eventually discovered that the Babylonians had created much of the knowledge Egyptians credited to Thoth. As early as 4000 BC, they were the first to measure planetary movements. They invented the abacus, the first sequential numeric system, and some of the earliest forms of astrology and astronomy. This information spread to Egypt and helped launch one of history's greatest cultures. And like the Egyptians, the Babylonians regarded their knowledge as divine.
Every temple was an observatory. It was actually an astronomical site for watching the planets. The whole concept of divining means trying to understand the will of the gods. And in order to understand the will of the gods, you have to have something to read about them, something that you see they're doing.
The Babylonians used one of the occult's oldest arts to understand their world, divination, or accessing the supernatural.
The movements of the planets through the heavens used to be considered the footprints of the gods and goddesses. And when they would catch up with each other and have interactions, or one would go retrograde and then go forward again, these things were all understood to affect the world.
It began in the Stone Age, when shamans invoked the spirits to ensure the success of the hunt.
Certain people who were distinguishable by early man as having sort of mystical experiences, and these would be the religious representatives of the clan. These people would have been communicating in ways of imagination to kind of talk to the gods or talk to the spirits or affect certain things that would happen.
In Egypt, divination developed into a sophisticated system of rituals and ceremonies designed to contact the gods who ruled their world.
Of course, you were trying to influence things like your success in business or the crops. The Egyptians used rituals, they used incantations, they used symbols to convey all of those things. The pharaoh himself was the head of their religion, so that he was probably the chief practitioner of both their religion and their magic.
Much of what is called ceremonial magic, the casting of spells, the use of magic words and incantations, came from the Egyptians. When Phoenician traders spread this knowledge throughout the Mediterranean world, magic became practical.
They codified an alphabet that would line up the sounds of speech, the number canon, and the zodiacal signs, planets, and features in the heavens, so that you could, with this alphabet, spell sacred words. You could also count and figure and calculate, and you could also do astronomy.
The sacred origins of these disciplines were gradually forgotten. In 1212 BC, Ramses II, the last great pharaoh of Egypt, died. Invading armies conquered the land of the Nile. Its occult secrets were lost, but not forever.
With new knowledge sourced from ancient Egypt and other keys such as the tarot, sacred geometry, the Fibonacci sequence, alchemy, hermetics, mythology, and biblical scripture, we can now begin to put these fragments of knowledge and symbolism together and finally have an understanding of what has been hidden from us. With this understanding, we can unlock what was left to us by our very knowledgeable and wise forefathers. Unfortunately, this truth of our divinity was taken from us with violence and torture and hoarded in the strongholds of the Antichrist establishment, otherwise known as the Vatican. But don't be naive in thinking this information would also not be known by the Freemasons and the elite families and royalty. They took this knowledge for themselves and sold us a lie of death and hell. The Crusades were nothing more than an excuse to pillage and plunder all civilizations of this knowledge, so it could be kept for themselves at the expense of the masses, who they enslaved into bondage to serve only them. They murdered almost 1 million Cathars and stole all their scriptures and most sacred holy texts. They called them heretics and sentenced them to the most painful deaths. Now all we have left are remnants of these ancient texts that survived destruction. The rest was stolen by the Antichrist Catholics to be put together in a twisted version of scripture, which they then used to lull the herd into a false belief of themselves and the reality in which they exist. Their agenda is to keep us in bondage to the physical plane, so we cannot move into our ethereal body, and they do this by giving us a perception of limit and lack about ourselves. We are told that we are beings that are finite and that we will die, and we either go to heaven if we are on our knees to them, or we go to hell to burn in eternity. However, worse still, some have now gone down the even more foolish path of thinking there is no higher God consciousness and they are not accountable for anything they do. The truth is, we are all immortal, but as with everything, it comes at a price. We must be worthy of that immortality, and we have accountability for our gift of life, as that is how the universe sees our expression of soul. The truth is, we really do need to be a good soul and have lived an honest life with good intent towards all fellow man and creatures. Then your immortality will be assured. For those that view this as acts of a vengeful God do not understand the laws of nature, because for nature to continue to expand and thrive in perfection, only the best will ever remain in existence. It is just the law of the universe and nothing personal, and we see it play out around us in the physical environment every day in nature. This is also the same for souls and our consciousness. We have to understand that everything always plays out on multiple levels, and our souls are subject to the same laws as all existence. In Hermetics, these different levels are described as the 3 great planes. They are the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. They are not so much even to be seen as distinctly separate either. They more or less merge into each other, but it is basically helpful to view reality as being layered and always playing out on these different levels in the macrocosm and in the microcosm. But this understanding of accountability is nothing new, for we see this also in the ancient Egyptian weighing of the heart ceremony, where the heart is weighed against the feather of truth. The feather actually represents Orion and the godlight that illuminates the hearts of men. It is no coincidence that we hear this judgment theme repeated across culture. This is because indeed we experience a cosmic event in which our reality is shifted and we are judged. Once a soul is judged worthy of being bestowed with highest consciousness, they are rewarded with immortality on a newly rebirthed earth at the height of consciousness to complete this infinite cycle of the soul once again. This is why all these great civilizations, such as ancient Egypt, Sumeria, Angkor Wat, ancient Greece, the Aztecs and Mayans, all sprung up from nowhere. And for those that think such a shift in reality would not be possible, even your own scientists have discovered this truth in quantum physics, though Hermetics knew of this law thousands of years ago, and it is called the law of vibration and is one of the 7 Hermetic principles of the universe. But we will talk more about this later. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is incorrect. We live in cycles within cycles, and all exist in rhythms of higher and lower, in and out, just like the tide. So we can understand this also happens within the consciousness of the collective souls. We can also see this explained in the Hermetic principle of rhythm. This cycle happens infinitely. There is no starting point that we expand only forward from, as in Darwin's theory. Each and every soul exists at 0 point, with the universe extending out from them in both the macrocosm and the microcosm. What Darwin's theory actually did was keep us bound to the physical plane once again. And once again, this is due to an agenda they have to keep us seeing reality in a certain perspective. However, this is part of a cycle we go through in our descent of consciousness. We begin the cycle in Zep Tepi, as the ancient Egyptians called it, which translates to first time, at the height of consciousness, as all the great civilizations around our planet did, only to descend once again into a time when humanity forgets its divinity and becomes broken and corrupt, full of empty souls who have forgotten who they are. This is the time we now live in. But soon we are about to begin that new cycle once again. The Maya actually were right, but just got the timing a bit off. But that is to be expected when you are orally handing down information over thousands and thousands of years. But the Maya knew it was about the sun changing, and the Hopi mythology also says this. And we must also remember, when we are so focused on times and dates, that the Maya and scripture say the exact time will not be known. Even so, the new energies are streaming in, and all but the unconscious can feel them. And know they are intensifying. Mother Earth is also reacting to this new energy. Her grids are firing up again as she adjusts and readies herself. She is also giving us clear messages to pay attention to our surroundings and our environment. We can only trust our instincts in these times. This new cycle began last year on the transit of Venus. We even saw the Queen take full advantage of this new energy, holding her 60th Jubilee right on the beginning of the transit. During that transit, Venus gave birth to a new cycle on the Sun. And it is important to note that Venus is also the timekeeper for the Maya, and they watch the movement of Venus intently. So this last transit of a 26,000-year precessional cycle is very important. If we look to mythology, we can equate this event to Isis giving birth to Horus, or the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus. The new son Horus was birthed on the Venus transit last year, and so began a battle between Horus, the new cycle on the sun, and the old and corrupted son Seth, that oversaw a corrupted and broken civilization, as told in the ancient Egyptian mythology. And the ancient Egyptian mythology tells of the battle ending with Osiris rewarding Horus as the victor. This is symbolic of the new light of Orion being transmuted through the new young son Horus, also symbolic of baby Jesus. However, we have to understand that Jesus and Christ have multiple layers symbolically, and it is the Christ light that returns to the divine male twin soul that gives the name Jesus and Christ a connection with the Son. This is why we see such reverence for the Son of God, because it is the Christ light that illuminates within the divine male, who is the Ark of the Covenant. The Lamb of God is God returning a part of himself to the divine male soul. An intense cosmic and celestial changes upon us. That light from Orion is returning to illuminate us once again, so we can once again access divine knowledge in a time of higher consciousness. We see this returning consciousness also present in the awakening we are experiencing as a collective. Even though the numbers are not large, there is a definite expansion happening nevertheless. Each soul is remembering their divinity by order of their birthing onto the physical plane. This, as with everything in the universe, is done following the Fibonacci sequence. The first souls that are birthed through are called divine, as they hold the strongest memory of their divinity and the divine knowledge within them. But with each subsequent soul that births through, this memory is diluted to finally, when we have an imbalance of souls populating this planet, we get the majority with very little memory of who they really are. With this expansion of consciousness returning, what we are seeing in fact is us remembering the truth of our divinity that was once lost to us. We are beginning to remember who we are and the truth of our existence. In the following videos, we will use this uncovered knowledge and the other keys available to us, as well as numerology and symbols, to reveal what has been hidden about our true divinity and what information can be revealed amongst all the symbolism in religious art, alchemical and hermetic drawings, and even authentic crop circles. What they are hiding from us is that we are birthed as souls that split into male and female upon manifestation from God's consciousness onto the material realm. We are all immortal twin souls that were birthed onto this physical realm from the consciousness of our God located in the Orion Nebula. Our God consciousness is known by many names: Osiris, Odin, Vishnu, God, and more. But every ancient civilization around the world knew the importance of the Orion Nebula and our God, for he shapes our reality. This is where a solid understanding of hermetics is required if you are to fully fathom this information. If we go back to where I mentioned reality shifting and quantum physics, confirming this could indeed be a possibility, as we are all just particles created from waveforms. This is where we need to have an understanding for the law of the mental universe, for it is then we understand that reality is made up of particles all held together in waveforms due to the thought projection of the mental universe. The best way to visualize this is how we see sand particles move into different geometric shapes on a board depending on what resonance is used, as in cymatics. When this understanding is applied to the hermetic law of the mental universe, we understand that the mental projection is resonance and light projected in waveform from the galactic core through the mind's eye of Orion, and finally brings us into existence on the material realm through the transmutation of energy of the sun and the moon. The sun is the projection of God consciousness, and the moon is the birther of souls, and the souls are birthed through the navel energy center. Edgar Cayce also confirms this and calls this energy center the Leiden. But it is not only the Orion Nebula that is a consciousness in our galaxy. Each of the other nebula are also a consciousness, and each manifesting a reality and souls onto a realm otherwise known as a planet. In our mental universe, using the energies of the sun and the moon, as well as the influences of the other planets, we are manifested onto the physical plane. But due to the earth always being in shadow half the time, there is another plane that exists on this realm, and that is the ethereal plane. Throughout this cycle as souls, we move between both planes, manifest in the physical form, and when we die a physical death, our soul moves into the ethereal plane to be rebirthed once again in the physical. However, in our truest form, we are ethereal, and we manifest into different containers, so to speak. This cycle of reincarnation happens over a 26,000-year cycle, until we're at the end of the cycle and the galactic core Atum once again gives us a pulse of illumination. Atum is infinite God energy with no consciousness. This is what all the nebula within the galaxy access to create souls and our reality, and this is where souls are returned if they do not pass judgment.
If one were to find the look and sound of ancient Egypt today, then it would be here, at a Coptic church. The words of these prayers and chants are the closest clues we have to the spoken language of the ancient Egyptians, and the devout faith of this service is a direct link to the deep spirituality of pharaonic Egypt. The chants, the incense, the hieroglyphs still used in the Coptic language can be traced to an even earlier religion that began here more than 50 centuries ago. Today, Cairo's houses of worship serve as a tangible link to that time. A time when magnificent temples provided the spiritual foundation for one of humankind's first great civilizations. The power of ancient Egypt's pharaohs was rooted in a complex hierarchy of gods and goddesses. It was a religion that prized ritual and ceremony. The temple was its centerpiece, a place of wonder and mystery.
Temples were points of contact between humanity and the divine. And the Egyptians basically conceived of the temple first and foremost as the god's dwelling place. So the basic purpose of the temple ritual was the care and feeding of the god.
The second function of the temple was to physically represent the Egyptian concept of creation. Egyptians believed that the world began as a morass of primeval muck, a place of chaos and disorder. But from this morass, the gods pushed up a mound or island of safety, which became Egypt. To symbolize this mound of creation, temples were always built with a slightly raised section in their center. The temple mound reminded Egyptians that the primeval chaos could return if the gods were not happy. For over 3,000 years, fear of chaos and longing for order were central to religious beliefs of Egyptian civilization. The line between the two was very clear to the Egyptian. The desert was chaos and the absence of life. The valley, nourished by the River Nile, was security. The temple was the institution that kept Egypt safe.
The god assured stability. It prevented chaos. You know that in the center of that temple, the god is there watching over you, and that Pharaoh on your behalf is going to make the proper offerings to that god, and that the world will continue to function properly. The Nile will rise, the floods will come, food will grow. It's all a reciprocal process that continues throughout time.
Temples quickly evolved to represent more than a home for the gods. They became the focus of all life in the community.
When you think about the temple in ancient Egypt, you're really thinking about something that's much broader than a religious place. It's a religious and economic place, something akin to, say, a great monastery in the Middle Ages in Europe. It owns land, it has herds. These were great economic institutions within the structure of Egypt.
The first temples date from the birth of Egyptian civilization over 4,000 years before the Christian era. These earliest holy places were probably little more than walls of reed mats or animal hides. Later temples were built of mud brick. Amazingly, some of these structures have survived. The huge mud brick temple of the early pharaoh Khazakemwi at Abydos is over 5,000 years old. But Khazakemwi's great walls were the exception. Most of these early temples vanished long ago, worn away by the relentless desert wind. This is a mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the Egyptian sun. Every early building from the pharaoh's palace to the peasant's hovel was made of this. In the right dry conditions, these can last for thousands of years, like at Khazakemwi's temple in Abydos. But most of habitable Egypt was close to the Nile and subject to constant flooding. After a few centuries, this stuff just dissolves back into the Nile. And the Egyptians knew it. Now, that's all right for the houses of the living. After all, life is just a temporary stage. But for the tombs of the dead and the temples of the gods, they had to last. The Egyptians were about to become the world's greatest masters of a new material, stone. And with it, they created some of the greatest monuments in human history. We've seen the beginnings of temple construction in Egypt, and now we see its magnificent culmination. This is the Temple of Karnak, and after the pyramids, it is the most spectacular architectural achievement in the history of Egypt. It is the greatest temple complex ever built. It grew to cover over 60 acres, a space large enough to enclose the Cathedral of Notre Dame and its grounds. Karnak Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile in what was once Thebes, the southern capital of ancient Egypt. Today, it is the city of Luxor, some 450 miles south of Cairo. A succession of pharaohs built and expanded this great temple over the course of 2 centuries, some 1,200 years before the Christian era. This great collection of gateways and column-filled halls was built to honor a single deity, Amun, the king of the gods.
He is the great god, the #1 god in Egypt. Because of that position as king of the gods, he receives the favor of Pharaoh. And all of the great halls that exist in here, the pylons and everything, are built for him.
Along with his wife, Mut, the goddess of motherhood, Amun ruled over the capital of Thebes. It was Amun, more than any other deity, who served to legitimize and continually renew the authority of the pharaohs. In the darkest, most silent recesses of Karnak, the god Amun resided in the form of a statue. Surprisingly, the statue was not a huge colossus, but a small image that could be easily carried during festivals. The lengthy walls of Karnak were made of huge sandstone blocks. The construction challenges faced by the builders were enormous. Remember, we're not talking about cranes, or even simple block and tackle to lift these enormous stones into place. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on dirt. Here we see the remnants of an enormous ramp up which the stones were dragged to their place in this huge pylon or gateway. As each course of stone was completed, the ramp was raised. When at last the wall was completed, the ramp was slowly dug away, and each course of stone was dressed with carvings and paintings on the way down. The great hypostyle hall is the heart of Karnak. Begun by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC, the hall is a forest of 130 columns, which once supported a roof over 80 feet above the temple floor. Windows in the roof admitted light, which flooded the dramatic central aisle. But the side aisles, so sunny today, then would have remained in dramatic shadow. 15 obelisks dedicated to the sun god Re were lifted into place throughout the temple. It took all of the engineering skill possessed by Egyptians to carve the massive shafts, drag them up dirt ramps, and carefully settle them into place. The tips of the obelisks were once capped with gold, so they might catch the first sunlight at dawn and the last at twilight. The glinting light from these shafts honored the sun's primary importance to sustaining all life. This great collection of monumental stonework was not erected by slaves, but by free citizens, for all Egyptians were expected to be available sometime during the year to work on the pharaoh's great construction projects. It was the equivalent of national service.
The labor that put these temples together is the common people. They're serving their labor time. It's their week to go work in Karnak. It's probably, 1, we've got to pay our taxes. 2, we're working on the home of the god. This is a great service to the king and to Amun. We're ensuring the stability of life throughout eternity by building here.
Although average working-class Egyptians built this temple, they probably were allowed to enter only the outer courtyards during the festivals. These inner halls were entered only by the most elite class of priests, for it was here that the god spirit was most present.